Resist it. I'm going to tell you why. For years in the American church, if you grew up in the church, not all of you did, but if you did, you've probably heard the 3 T's of stewarding, of managing. And the 3 T's were this: time, talent, and treasure. And there's a bunch of people who grew up in the church who think 2 out of 3 ain't bad, right? You can talk about your time and how you give of the church, and you can talk about your expertise, your talents, but I want to talk about the 3rd T. It's like the 3rd rail of church work. Don't talk about treasure. But here's the thing. If we all said 2 out of 3 ain't bad, we wouldn't be here today. There'd be no church. That's just the reality of it. And if we all said, yes, all 3 T's are important, all of us, I would never have to talk about budget money ever again. Those are the 2 sides of that, right? Now, it's funny that I mentioned the 3 T's, time, talent, and treasure. Jesus actually had an encounter with somebody who was one of those 2 out of 3 ain't bad kind of people. So one day, this guy comes up to Jesus, and he asks him, he's like, what do I got to do to get into heaven? It's the question. Now, Jesus could read this guy from a mile away. He knew that's not really what he was interested in. Like God, Jesus can read your heart. And he knew this guy was not genuinely worried about going to heaven. So Jesus gives him a very ordinary, typical, 1st century rabbi response for anybody in Israel. It's a good response because it's true, but Jesus was not going to invest his time in a guy who was asking questions for the wrong reason, right? Here's your typical answer. If you want to go to heaven, if you want to enter life, obey the commandments. It's a very rabbinical 1st century answer. It's a good answer. But he doesn't go into detail because Jesus knew that's not really what he's asking. And you think, well, that's the end of the conversation. Then the guy goes into describing how well he follows the commandments. Oh, I follow the commandments perfectly. I am the best commandment follower there has ever been. I do it all just perfectly, and it is beautiful. I make no mistakes. I totally follow God. This guy was not asking about his faith. He was just talking about himself. Surprised he didn't get an arm sprain trying to pat himself on the back, right? It's all about him. And he can't let it go. So he pushes on. He's like, okay, Jesus, if I do all that, like, what am I missing here? What's my blind spot? What am I lacking? Dude, let it go. You just leave well enough. You do not want to go there with Jesus. I'm just telling, if I'd been there, I would have cut him off. I'm like, you need to move on. But he kept pushing. And so Jesus gave him the answer. He goes, you want to know your blind spot? Okay, here's your blind spot. If you want to be perfect, go sell all your possessions and give to the poor. And then you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. See, Jesus already knew he was holding back. Jesus knew this guy's sacred cow, and he just skewered it. Jesus did this to get his attention. Now notice, Jesus didn't say, sell all you have and give it to me. He didn't say that. This wasn't about personal gain. He was pointing out the stumbling block in this guy's life. And he pointed it out in such a way to get his attention. He's like, this is the thing that's preventing you from actually having an abundant life, not this pretend life you seem to be having. And I know that how people view money can be an impediment to their walk in Christ. But hear this. It's never about the amount. It's never about the amount of money you give. It's always about the proportion of what you give to what you have. St. Paul even says it later on in 2 Corinthians. He's like, your gift is acceptable according to what you have, not according to what one doesn't have. So if you're like, well, I can never give like, Warren Buffett, well, you're not supposed to. I never will either. But it's about according to what you do have. So let me just clarify that. So let me just boil this down. Make it super simple. If you're at the low end of the economic range and you only take home $100 a week, which is not a lot, then $10 is a very generous gift. If you're only making $100 a week, $10 is very generous. When you scale up, maybe it's a different amount. I mean, even Jesus, you heard Pastor Brian read this, he said, saw that woman. It was like a real life object lesson. The poor lady, the widow, giving money at the temple, giving her offering in comparison to all the rich people giving their offering. And Jesus says to them, he says, I tell you the truth, disciples, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she gave out of her poverty. And she put in all she had to live on. Generosity is proportional to what you have. It's not about the amount. So when you think about our core values, welcome into worship, into learning, into service, can lead to generosity if you're willing to take a step of faith. That you're willing to trust that God is not going to let you fall into a dark hole of poverty. Matter of fact, God says, you can test me in this. You don't have to be all in. If you go to Malachi chapter 3, Old Testament prophet, God's like, you can just test it out and see if I won't bless you. Just see what happens. You don't have to be all in.